Chris Lynch News with Airpark Canterbury. Secure, stress-free parking, just minutes from Christchurch Airport.
Alan, I'll start with you. This is the big question that everybody wants to know in Christchurch, and that is, why is Christchurch's water still being chlorinated despite no recent contamination and, of course, a long-standing reputation for high-quality groundwater? What is going on?
So you're right, Chris. Christchurch residents are very lucky. You've got some of the highest quality water that you extract from your aquifers in the world. It's right up there. So there are two separate reasons that chlorine is required in a water supply. One of those is around disinfecting for, in this case, potential viruses that come from your source water, those aquifers. And that research that we were down earlier in the week, briefing councillors in Christchurch on the results of, said you don't have viruses in your source water, which is great news. Probably that's what we have long believed, but now we've got the evidence to suggest we don't, and that knocks out one of the two reasons that you might have needed chlorine in our view. So there's some work to do just on new arrangements, having knocked them out. But effectively, that's what it does. The second reason, and this is why Christchurch still has chlorination, is after you've extracted the water and potentially treated it, you've got to run it through the pipes and the networks underground to get it to the house. And contamination events can happen in the network after you've extracted the water. So it's not about the quality of water. Your water's good. It's about what happens after it leaves the extraction point treatment plant and goes through the network. And we know that Christchurch does have leakage of water in its networks. You're far from the worst. You're not the top of class. You have in the 20%, I think, on average as a leakage rate. If water can get out, contamination can get in. And so the government changed the rules after the Havelock North episode and required some residual treatment, which is usually chlorine, to be mandatory in all of those networks. There is a pathway, Chris. If you don't like that as a community, you can seek an exemption from us. That's where we come in, saying we don't want chlorine. We think our supply is pretty good. How about it? And so the opportunity is there for Christchurch to do that. I'll leave it there because you'll have follow-up questions.
Yeah, I will. Steve, I guess this question could be for you, and that is, we have applied this blanket risk approach to our distribution networks, and I know that obviously the recent testing has been rather positive for Christchurch. In layman's terms, give us the positive stuff first.
Beneficially, you've got high-quality groundwater, which means there isn't the same level of treatment required as it comes out of the ground. The issue is that potential recontamination or contamination that happens as it's passing through the pipes. And we know in Christchurch there have been previous contamination events in the distribution zone, and it's a result of those contamination events that chlorination was introduced a number of years ago. So, for example, in Riccarton, there's a high number of an indicator of contamination, and there was a need to move quite quickly after that to ensure that water remains safe. So a bit of work required still to manage those sorts of risks, the sorts of contamination we know has happened in the past. But the positive, as Alan has said, is that you're dealing with good source water. So the actual level of treatment required right at the outset, the need for bacterial treatment, need for protozoa treatment, and need for viral treatment, it's close to nil, quite frankly. So then it's what needs to be done to keep the water safe as it's passing through the network.
Okay, obviously all these standards that we speak about this morning, it's all based on the Havelock North outbreak, or at least that's where some of it stemmed from. I think, Alan, to you on this one, is that model still relevant?
So a lot of the features of our drinking water rules and requirements, if you like, are common features internationally. The drinking water standards, how much of a certain thing can you have in your water before it becomes a problem? Those are all based on science and internationally quite common. What changed after Havelock was a shift from elements being voluntary to being mandatory and compulsory. And you're right, an assumption, a requirement that all suppliers of certain types have to do something. So Christchurch got caught up in that with the residual chlorine. Of course, in Havelock North, they also sourced their water from a deep groundwater source, had what they thought was a secure bore, and it probably wasn't. And in fact, had Havelock North had chlorine, none of those 5,000 people would have become ill. It would have dealt with the event. But Parliament has recognised that there are communities, some communities don't want chlorine in their water. Would recognise that Christchurch, I grew up there, very well aware about the views on chlorine. There is a pathway, and so they have put an exemption pathway into the system for us to consider. They did that, presumably, thinking that an approval was a possible outcome. So, we're only 3 years old. We've been working our way through some applications to figure out what that line is. Our undertaking, I guess, to councils and their customers is, if you have an application and you don't quite make it, we want to give you the clarity on what you need to do in order to get that change to a yes.
Okay, well, let's discuss that pathway. Steve, this is probably for you, I suppose. You've said that the issue is with the distribution network, not with our water source. So in very layman's terms, it might be hard to try and do that this morning, but what specific problems in the network of Christchurch are preventing the removal of chlorine at this stage, and what does the council need to do to satisfy the water regulator that this pathway could actually be possible?
So the discussions we've been having are, what are the risks? Where are the areas where you've got potential contamination that may enter into that distribution zone? And what are the things realistically that can be done to manage that? Now, because where we're at a point in time, it's actually cheaper and more efficient to add chlorine than it is to do some of the other risk mitigation measures. So
right.
Alan's already spoke to leak reduction. So the fact that whenever you've got a water that's being lost from the network, it does two things. So one is that it introduces an area where contaminants can get in. But the other thing it does is it reduces the pressure of the water. And you can imagine when you have a high water pressure, the likelihood of contaminants entering into that water is less. But as soon as the pressure drops, it's easier for contaminants to enter into that stream. So that can happen in a couple of ways. One is naturally through the ground. So often sewer mains are underground. You can have other contamination that sits within the ground itself. What we don't want to see is pressure dropping and so many leaks being across the network that you have that risk of cross-contamination, basically fecal matter getting into the drinking water. So we want to avoid that. The other thing that we look to is you can imagine in your water network, you have things plumbed into the drinking water network. So you can have a series of pumps in buildings, commercial units are all connected in, and they have variable pressure within those buildings too. Now, if their pressure is higher than the distribution zone water pressure, again, you can get what's called backflow. So things transferring across that has contaminants that enter into the distribution zone. So what we ask is that there's a good understanding of what are those backflow risks and what are the conversations that are happening with building owners, with those that are constructing new connections into the network to manage that risk effectively and reduce that risk of backflow. So water pressure, backflow. And the other thing is incidents happen. We know they happen. We know from the 2023 event that the combination of pressure, leaks, etc., means that sometimes things just happen that you can't anticipate. The important thing is, how do you deal with it? Can you constrain the area that's exposed? Can you isolate the network? Can you implement emergency response procedures to reduce that risk of contamination spreading more broadly across the network? Because the wonderful thing about drinking water is not only does it provide what's essential to everybody's well-being and for us to function as individuals, but as soon as you introduce a disease vector into that drinking water, you've suddenly contaminated a massive proportion of the population, which is what happened in Havelock. So part of that response procedure is, okay, if this contamination is getting in, how is it managed immediately to minimise that risk of it spreading more broadly?
So I'd wrap it up into three things then, Chris, you've got the leaks and getting those to down to a acceptable level, if you like, and it'll be a bit case by case for each network. You've got the backflow issue and having backflow prevention. That's a technical thing where you can put some instruments in place to do that. And then the third area I'd say is being assured that you're prepared to respond appropriately and quickly if there is an incident, and that you're monitoring and watching probably more intensely than you might if you and forget. So those would be the three areas.
So, obviously, as Steve was saying, there is that trade-off between how much more Christchurch City Council puts in to deal with the infrastructure, because chlorination is obviously cheaper. Do you have any, or have you given any advice to the council as to how much more it could possibly cost to bring it up to a standard to remove chlorine, or is that something for them to deal with themselves, Alan?
It's really a question for Christchurch, because there is always a range of approaches that you can do to manage the issue, and it will vary depending on each network. So obviously Christchurch has got a number of distribution zones. We're not dealing with one distribution zone, although they're all connected. So some solutions will be slightly different, but Christchurch will have some views already on these issues, I would imagine, and some options that they could work through. So,
but our job is to be as clear as we can to the council. What's it going to take? So that's the bit that we can lean into and help with our technical experts, and then the council has the ability to then go away and cost up the different options for meeting those requirements.
What is the realistic time frame? This is probably a big question. What is the realistic time frame for chlorine to be removed from Christchurch's water supply?
Yeah, so we stand ready to do our part of the work if an application is of interest to the council. We've just stood up a panel of expertise so that if we get a big application, we've got the technical expertise to process that at any time, because we don't have the resources to sit on a big team there. But the answer to your question is going to lie with the councillors, really, and their team as to how they want to approach that over what time. They may, for example, want to look at an application for one part of the network and try it out. And if it works, they then roll it out, or they may be comfortable with whether they've got to, or they may want to do it all at once. There's obviously public policy and political considerations for the council then about how they do that. That's in their hands.
Steve, does the absence of viral contamination in the recent testing, does that strengthen Christchurch's case for an exemption, or is that just good news for good news' sake?
What it does is it certainly makes the process easier, that we are required to take into account the level of treatment required. So obviously there's some work to be done around having those findings flow through to the way that the rules are set. So it certainly does make that easier. The work then becomes of how do you manage the risk associated with the distribution network again? So that's that point that I covered previously. So it's helpful, it's beneficial. I think that's reassuring for a lot of people. It's always good to have.
It did knock one of the two problems out, didn't it, Steve? Because you didn't have the contact time, so you weren't compliant with that part of the shop, which means we're not allowed to issue you an exemption. That barrier's gone. So we're just down to the network now.
Okay, well, that's some good news. Just a couple of final questions. I know, and you probably know this, that Greenpeace has described the recent comments by yourselves, the regulator about Christchurch's water safety as misleading. Of course, they are citing high nitrate levels in Canterbury, not necessarily in Christchurch, but, wider Canterbury groundwater. This is probably for you, Alan. Do you share similar concerns about nitrate contamination in the wider Canterbury region?
Yeah, so look, I've been following the issue around nitrates down there in the reporting. First thing I'd say is Greenpeace is talking about different water supply than we are, different source water. So Christchurch takes its water from the deep aquifers, and they are good. We monitor and test for nitrates, and there are no exceedances in there at all. So your public water supply is good. And in fact, when we look at all of the public water supplies in the South Island, We very rarely have a nitrate exceedance. We've had an issue in Waimate, which has been building for a while, and they're going to have to deal with that, Waimate District. But public water supplies are not recording alarming levels.
These are private wells, aren't they,
Yes,
largely?
Private bores, and they are usually quite shallow bores that are private families and farms are using, and they are recording some nitrates, which is not necessarily surprising from the industry and agricultural activities around it, but two different things.
Right. Just before I let you go, gentlemen, give me some good news to leave this interview this morning. People watching this now, they want to know when chlorine's going to be. I know you can't say that when, but give me something that's going to leave me with some hope that chlorine will eventually go. I mean, I know we've talked about that buzzword pathway. Are both of you gentlemen, are you both confident this pathway is the way forward for Christchurch?
We've got a role to play, and in terms of our role to play, there were a couple of barriers. One of those got knocked off with the great research we were able to do with the City Council and ECAN there. The other barrier we stand ready to have a look at and work on if the community and council want us to.
I think the public can be assured that the council has a good process for managing the safety of drinking water, and that it's always had, we certainly have the public interest at heart. With all of the conversations that we're having at the moment, it's reassuring research that's come in, and we'll continue to look at the public health effects and ensure that those are well considered and canvassed. But play our part in sharing information openly and ensure that everybody has access to the same information. Much of this is understanding the risks where they sit and the consequences of various actions. And I certainly, we're very happy to continue to provide that information.
And we'll do it as transparently as we can. I guess that's the other element, Chris, is we've stood up a new regulator, had to figure some things out. And that's why we partnered with the council on this research, so that they got the information the same day we did, same time we did. And so for the public, any considerations on this stuff, to the extent we can, that the information will be made transparent as soon as it can. But the rest is with the locals, and I don't want to pretend it's going to be free. There will be costs, but that's for the local community to work through.
Alan and Steve, really good to have your insight on the program this morning. Thank you so much. Have a lovely weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.